evening, everyone out there. I hope that everyone is curled up quite cozily, perhaps with their beverage of choice. Today I am drinking an all-right green tea. It'll do for the evening. At least it can be oversteeped. My accompaniment tonight is a member of St. Beryl's, but we've gagged her for the evening. So I hope that will keep us all in good spirits. And if you hear any other rumblings about, I believe that St. Beryl's had the opportunity to summon a couple extra demons for the night. They are small and furry and might climb on things, but we'll try to get along nonetheless.
They're very snuggly.
Tonight I shall be reading from the Good Book, and if you think that I have forgotten, or dare I say, lost the stripped cover, have no fear. I am simply keeping it separate to preserve its already quite tattered state. I do want to share with you one special edition of this book. I happen to work at a library in northern Illinois that is the repository for the science, fiction, and fantasy writers of the world. I think I have that right. SIFWA. SIFWA is the abbreviation. We are the repository for their annual awards, and this happens to be the second copy of the deposited UK edition of Good Omens that was weeded this year, and I, as a library employee, stole from the remains area. Not stole. It's quite above board, I assure you. Now, let us begin. Anathema device. Her mother, who was not a great student of religious matters, happened to read the word one day and thought it was a lovely name for a girl, was 8.5 years old. And she was reading the book, under the bedclothes, with a torch. Other children learned to read on basic primers with colored pictures of apples, balls, cockroaches, and so forth. Not the device family. Anathema had learned to read from the book. It didn't have any apples and balls in it. It did have a rather good 18th century woodcut of Agnes Nutter being burned at the stake, looking rather cheerful about it. The first word she could recognize was nice. Very few people at the age of 8.5 know that nice also means scrupulously exact, but Anathema was one of them. The second word was accurate. The first sentence she had ever read aloud was, "I tell ye this, and I charge ye with my words, four shall ride, and four shall also ride, and three shall ride as the sky as twixt, and one shall ride in flames, and there shall be no stopping them, not fish, nor rain, nor road, neither devil nor angel, and ye shall be there also, Anathema." Anathema liked to read about herself. There were books which caring parents who read the right Sunday papers could purchase with their children's names printed in as the heroine or hero. This was meant to interest the child in the book. In Anathema's case, it wasn't only her in the book, and it had been spot on so far, but her parents and her grandparents and everyone back to the 17th century. She was too young and too self-centered at this point to attach any importance to the fact that there was no mention made of her children, or indeed any events in her future further away than 11 years' time. When you're 8.5, 11 years is a lifetime, and of course, if you believe the book, it would be. She was a bright child, with a pale face and black eyes and hair. As a rule, she tended to make people feel uncomfortable, a family trait she had inherited, along with being more psychic than was good for her, from great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. She was precocious and self-possessed. The only thing about Anathema her teachers ever had the nerve to upbraid her for was her spelling, which was not so much appalling as 300 years too late. The nuns took baby A and swapped it with baby B under the noses of the attaché's wife and the Secret Service men by the cunning expedients of wheeling one baby away, to be weighed, love, got to do that, it's of the law, and wheeling another baby back a little later. The cultural attaché himself, Thaddeus J. Dowling, had been called back to Washington in a hurry a few days earlier, but he had been on the phone to Mrs. Dowling throughout the birth experience, helping her with her breathing. It didn't help that he'd been talking on the other line to his investment counselor. At one point he'd been forced to put her on hold for 20 minutes. But that was okay. Having a baby is the single most joyous co-experience that two human beings can share, and he wasn't going to miss a second of it. He'd got one of the Secret Service men to videotape it for him. Evil, in general, does not sleep, and therefore doesn't see why anyone else should. But Crowley liked sleep. It was one of the pleasures of the world, especially after a heavy meal. He'd slept right through most of the 19th century, for example, not because he needed to, simply because he enjoyed it. Although, he did have to get up in 1832 to go to the lavatory. One of the pleasures of the world. Well, he'd really better start enjoying them now while there was still time. The Bentley roared into the night, heading east. Of course, he was all in favor of Armageddon in general terms. If anyone had asked him why he'd been spending centuries tinkering in the affairs of mankind, he'd have said, "Oh, in order to bring about Armageddon and the triumph of hell." But it was one thing to do the work to bring it about, and quite another for it to actually happen. Crowley had always known that he would be around when the world ended, because he was immortal and wouldn't have any alternative. But he'd hoped it would be a long way off, because he rather liked people. It was a major failing of them in a demon. Oh, he did his best to make their short lives miserable, because that was his job, and nothing he could think up was half as bad as the stuff they thought up themselves. They seemed to have a talent for it. It was built into the design somehow. They were born into a world that was against them in 1,000 little ways, and then devoted most of their energies to making it worse. Over the years, Crowley had found it increasingly difficult to find anything demonic to do which showed up against the natural background of generalized nastiness. There had been times over the past millennium when he felt like sending a message back below saying, "Look, we might as well give up right now. We might as well shut it all down. Dis and pandemonium and everywhere, and move up here. There's nothing we can do to them that they don't do to themselves, and they do things we've never even thought of, often involving electrodes. They've got what we lack. They've got imagination. And electricity, of course." One of them had written it, hadn't he? "Hell is empty, and all the devils are here." Crowley had gotten a commendation for the Spanish Inquisition. He had been in Spain then, mainly hanging around cantinas in the nicer parts, and hadn't even known about it until the commendation arrived. He'd gone to have a look, and come back and got drunk for a week. That Hieronymus Bosch, what a weirdo. And just when you'd think they were more malignant than ever hell could be, they could also occasionally show more grace than heaven ever dreamed of. Often the same individual was involved. It was this free will thing, of course. It was a bugger. Aziraphale had tried to explain it to him once. The whole point, he said, this was somewhere around 1020 when they'd first reached their little arrangement. The whole point was that when a human was good or bad, it was because they wanted to be, whereas people like Crowley, and of course himself, were set in their ways right from the start. People couldn't become truly holy, he said, unless they also had the opportunity to be definitively wicked. Crowley had thought about this for some time, and around 1023, said, "Hang on. That only works, right? If you start everyone off equal, okay? You can't have someone start off in a muddy shack in the middle of a war zone and expect them to do as well as someone born in a castle." "Ah," Aziraphale had said, "that's the good bit. The lower you start, the more opportunities you have." Crowley had said, "That's lunatic." "No," said Aziraphale, "it's ineffable." Aziraphale. The enemy, of course, but an enemy for 6,000 years now, which sort of made him a friend. Crowley reached down and picked up the car phone. Being a demon, of course, was supposed to mean you had no free will, but you couldn't hang around humans for very long without learning a thing or two. Mr. Young had not been too keen on Damien, or Wormwood, or any of Sister Mary Loquacious' other suggestions, which had covered half of hell, most of the golden years of Hollywood. "Well," she said finally, a little hurt, "I don't think there's anything wrong with Errol or Carrie. Very nice American names, both of them." "I'd fancied something more, well, traditional," explained Mr. Young. "We've always gone in for good, simple names in our family." Sister Mary beamed. "Oh, that's right. The old names is always best, if you ask me." "A decent English name, like people had in the Bible," said Mr. Young. "Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John," he said speculatively. Sister Mary winced. "Only they've never struck me as very good Bible names, really," Mr. Young added. "They sound more like cowboys, footballers." "Saul's nice," said Sister Mary, making the best of it. "I don't want something too old-fashioned," said Mr. Young. "Okay. Very modern sounding. Cain, really," Sister Mary tried. Mr. Young looked doubtful. Well, there's always Adam," said Sister Mary. "That should be safe enough," she thought. "Adam?" said Mr. Young. It would be nice to think that the Satanist nuns had the surplus baby B, discreetly adopted, that he grew to be a normal, happy, laughing child, active, exuberant, and that after that grew further to become a normal, fairly contented adult. And perhaps that's what happened. Let your mind dwell on his junior school prize for spelling, his unremarkable, although quite pleasant time at university, his job in the payroll department of the Tadfield and Norton Building Society, his lovely wife. Possibly you would like to imagine some children and a hobby, restoring vintage motorcycles perhaps, or breeding tropical fish. You don't want to know what could have happened to Baby B. We like your version better anyway. He probably wins prizes for his tropical fish." In a small house in Dorking, Surrey, a light was on in a bedroom window. Newton Pulsifer was 12 and thin and bespectacled, and he should have been in bed hours ago. His mother, though, was convinced of her child's genius and let him stay up past his bedtime to do his experiments. His current experiment was changing a plug on an ancient Bakelite radio that his mother had given him to play with. He sat at what he proudly called his worktop, a battered old table covered in curls of wire, batteries, little light bulbs, and a homemade crystal set that had never worked. He hadn't managed to get the Bakelite radio working either yet, but then again he never seemed to get that far. 3 slightly crooked model airplanes hung on cotton cords from his bedroom ceiling. Even a casual observer could have seen that they were made by someone who was both painstaking and very careful, and also no good at making model airplanes. He was hopelessly proud of all of them, even the Spitfire, where he'd made rather a mess of the wings. He pushed his glasses back up the bridge of his nose, squinted down at the plug, and put down the screwdriver. He had high hopes for it this time. He had followed all the instructions on plug changing on page 5 of the boy's own book of practical electronics, including 101 safe and educational things to do with electricity. He had attached the correct color-coded wires to the correct pins. He had checked that it was the right amperage fuse. He screwed it all back together. So far, no problems. He plugged it into the socket. Then he switched the socket on. Every light in the house went out. Newton beamed with pride. He was getting better. Last time he'd done it, he blacked out the whole of Dorking, and a man from the electric had come over and had a word with his mum. He had a burning and totally unrequited passion for things electrical. They had a computer at school, and half a dozen studious children stayed on after school, doing things with punched cards. When the teacher in charge of the computer had finally acceded to Newton's pleas to be allowed to join them, Newton had only got to feed one little card into the machine. It had chewed it up and choked fatally on it. Newton was certain that the future was in computers, and when the future arrived, he'd be ready, in the forefront of the new technology. The future had its own ideas on this. It was all in the book. Adam, thought Mr. Young. He tried saying it to see how it sounded. Adam. He stared down at the golden curls of the adversary, destroyer of kings, angel of the bottomless pit, great beast that is called dragon, prince of this world, father of lies, spawn of Satan, and lord of darkness. You know, he concluded after a while, I think he actually looks like an Adam. It had not been a dark and stormy night. The dark and stormy night occurred 2 days later, about 4 hours after both Mrs. Dowling and Mrs. Young and their respective babies had left the building. It was a particularly dark and stormy night, and just after midnight, as the storm reached its height, a bolt of lightning struck the convent of the Chattering Order, setting fire to the roof of the vestry. No one was badly hurt by the fire, but it went on for some hours, doing a fair amount of damage in the process. The instigator of the fire lurked on a nearby hilltop and watched the blaze. He was tall, thin, and a Duke of Hell. It was the last thing that needed to be done before his return to the nether regions, and he had done it. He could safely leave the rest to Crowley. Hastur went home. Technically, Aziraphale was a principality, but people made jokes about that these days. On the whole, neither he nor Crowley would have chosen each other's company, but they were both men, or at least men-shaped creatures of the world, and the arrangement had worked to their advantage all this time. Besides, you grew accustomed to the only other face that had been around more or less consistently for 6 millennia. The arrangement was very simple, so simple in fact that it didn't really deserve the capital letter, which it had got for simply being in existence for so long. It was the sort of sensible arrangement that many isolated agents working in awkward conditions, a long way from their superiors, reach with their opposite number when they realize they have more in common with their immediate opponents than their remote allies. It meant a tacit non-interference in certain of each other's activities. It made certain that while neither really won, also neither really lost, and both were able to demonstrate to their masters the great strides they were making against a cunning and well-informed adversary. It meant that Crowley had been allowed to develop Manchester, while Aziraphale had a free hand in the whole of Shropshire. Crowley took Glasgow, Aziraphale had Edinburgh. Neither claimed responsibility for Milton Keynes. A note for the Americans and other aliens. Milton Keynes is a new city approximately halfway between London and Birmingham. It was built to be modern, efficient, healthy, and, all in all, a pleasant place to live. Many Britons find this amusing, but both reported it a success. And then, of course, it had seemed even natural that they should, as it were, hold the fort for one another whenever common sense dictated. Both were of angel stock, after all. If one was going to Hull for a quick temptation, it made sense to nip across the city and carry out a standard brief moment of divine ecstasy. It'd get done anyway, and being sensible about it gave everyone more free time and cut down on expenses. Aziraphale felt the occasional pang of guilt about this, but centuries of association with humanity was having the same effect on him as it was having on Crowley, except in the other direction. Besides, the authorities didn't seem much to care who did anything, so long as it got done. Currently, what Aziraphale was doing was standing with Crowley by the duck pond at St. James Park. They were feeding the ducks. The ducks in St. James Park are so used to being fed bread by secret agents meeting clandestinely that they have developed their own Pavlovian reaction. Put a St. James Park duck in a laboratory cage and showed a picture of two men, one usually wearing a coat with a fur collar and the other something somber with a scarf, and it'll look up expectantly. The Russian cultural attaché's black bread is particularly sought after by the more discerning duck, while the head of MI9's soggy hovis with marmite is relished by the connoisseurs. Aziraphale tossed a crust to a scruffy-looking drake, which caught it and sank immediately. The angel turned to Crowley. "Really, my dear," he murmured. "Sorry," said Crowley. "I was forgetting myself." The duck bobbed angrily to the surface. "Of course, we knew something was going on," Aziraphale said, "but one somehow imagines this sort of thing happening in America. They go in for that sort of thing over there." "It might do yet, at that," said Crowley gloomily. He gazed thoughtfully across the park to the Bentley, the back wheel of which was being industriously clamped. "Oh yes, the American diplomat," said the angel. "Rather showy, one feels, as if Armageddon was some sort of cinematographic show that you wish to sell in as many countries as possible." "Every country," said Crowley. "The earth and all the kingdoms thereof." Aziraphale tossed the last scrap of bread at the ducks, who went off to pester the Bulgarian naval attaché, and a furtive-looking man in a Cambridge tie, and carefully disposed of the paper bag in a wastepaper bin. He turned to face Crowley. "We will win, of course." "You don't want that," said the demon. "Why not, pray?" "Listen," said Crowley desperately. "How many musicians do you think your side have got, huh? First grade, I mean." Aziraphale was taken aback. "Well, I think," he began. "Two," said Crowley. "Elgar and Liszt, that's all. We've got the rest. Beethoven, Brahms, all the Bachs, Mozart, the lot. Can you imagine an eternity of Elgar?" Aziraphale shut his eyes. "All too easily," he groaned. "That's it, then," said Crowley, with a gleam of triumph. He knew Aziraphale's weak spot all right. "No more compact discs. No more Albert Hall. No more proms. No more Glenburn. Just celestial harmonies all day long." "Ineffable," Aziraphale murmured. "Like eggs without salt, you said. Which reminds me, no salt, no eggs, No gravlax with dill sauce. No fascinating little restaurants where they know you. No Daily Telegraph crossword. No small antique shops. No bookshops. No interesting old editions. No, Crowley scraped the bottom of Aziraphale's barrel of interests, Regency silver snuff boxes. But after we win, life will be better, croaked the angel. But it won't be as interesting. Look, you know I'm right. You'd be as happy with a harp as I'd be with a pitchfork. You know we don't play harps. And we don't use pitchforks. I was being rhetorical. They stared at one another. Aziraphale spread his elegantly manicured hands. My people are more than happy for it to happen, you know. It's what it's all about, you see. The great final test, flaming swords, 4 horsemen, seas of blood, the whole tedious business. He shrugged. And then, game over, insert coin, said Crowley. Sometimes I find your method of expression a little difficult to follow. I like the seas as they are. It doesn't have to happen. You don't have to test everything to destruction just to see if you made it right. Aziraphale shrugged again. That's ineffable wisdom for you, I'm afraid. The angel shuddered, pulling his coat around him. Grey clouds were piling up over the city. Let's go somewhere warm, he said. You're asking me, said Crowley glumly. They walked in somber silence for a while. It's not that I disagree with you, said the angel, as they plodded across the grass. It's just that I'm not allowed to disobey. You know that. Me too, said Crowley. Aziraphale gave him a sidelong glance. Oh, come now, he said. You're a demon, after all. Yeah, but my people are only in favor of disobedience in general terms. It's specific disobedience that come down on heavily, such as disobedience to themselves. You got it? You'd be amazed. Or perhaps you wouldn't be. How long do you think we've got? Crowley waved a hand at the Bentley, which unlocked its doors. The prophecies differ, said Aziraphale, sliding into the passenger seat. Certainly until the end of the century, although we may expect certain phenomenon before then. Most of the prophets of the past millennium were more concerned with scansion than accuracy. Crowley pointed at the ignition key. It turned. What? He said. You know, said the angel helpfully. And the world unto an end shall come in Tumpty 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 1, or 2, or 3, or whatever. There aren't many good rhymes for 6, so that's probably a good year to be in. And what sort of phenomena? 2-headed calves, signs in the sky, geese flying backwards, showers of fish, that sort of thing. The presence of the Antichrist affects the natural operation of causality. Crowley put the Bentley in gear. Then he remembered something. He snapped his fingers. The wheel clamps disappeared. Let's have lunch, he said. I owe you from, when was it? Paris, 1793, said Aziraphale. Oh, yes, Reign of Terror. Was that one of yours, or one of ours? Wasn't it yours? Can't recall. It was quite a good restaurant, though. As they drove past an astonished traffic warden, his notebook spontaneously combusted, to Crowley's amazement. I'm pretty certain I didn't do that, he said. Aziraphale blushed. That was me, he said. I had always thought that your people invented them. Did you? We thought they were yours. Crowley stared as the smoke in the rearview mirror. Come on, he said. Let's do the Ritz. Crowley had not bothered to book. In his world, table reservations were things that happened to other people. Aziraphale collected books. If he were totally honest with himself, he would have to have admitted that his bookshop was simply somewhere to store them. He was not unusual in this. In order to maintain his cover as a typical second-hand bookseller, he used every means short of actual physical violence to prevent customers from making a purchase. unpleasant damp smells, glowering looks, erratic opening hours. He was incredibly good at it. He had been collecting for a long time, and like all collectors, he specialized. He had more than 60 books of predictions concerning developments in the last handful of centuries of the second millennium. He had a penchant for wild first editions, and he had a complete set of the infamous Bibles individually named from errors in typesetting. These Bibles included the Unrighteous Bible, so called from a printer's error which caused it to proclaim in 1 Corinthians, "Know ye not that the unrighteous shall inherit the kingdom of God?" And the Wicked Bible, printed by Barker and Lucas in 1632, in which the word "not" was omitted from the 7th commandment, making it, "Thou shalt commit adultery." There were the Discharge Bible, the Treacle Bible, the Standing Fishes Bible, the Charing Cross Bible, and the rest. Aziraphale had them all. Even the very rarest Bible, a Bible published in 1651 by the London publishing firm of Bilton and Skaggs. It had been the first of their 3 great publishing disasters. The book was commonly known as the Bugger All This Bible. The lengthy compositor's error, if such it may be called, occurs in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 48, verse 5. "And by the border of Dan, from the east side to the west side, a portion for Asher. And by the border of Asher, from the east side even unto the west side, a portion for Naphtali. And by the border of Naphtali, from the east side unto the west side, a portion for Manasseh. Bugger all this for a lark. I am sick to my heart of typesetting. Master Bilton is no gentleman, and Master Skaggs no more than a tight-fisted Southwark knobstick. I tell ye, on a day like this, anyone with half an ounce of sense should be out in the sunshine, and not stuck here all the livelong day in this mouldy old By Our Lady workshop. And by the border of Ephraim, from the east side even unto the west side, a portion for Reuben." The Bugger All This Bible was also noteworthy for having 27 verses in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, instead of the more usual 24. They follow verse 24, which in the King James Version reads, "So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turned every way, to keep the way of the tree of life, and read, And the Lord spake until the angel that guarded the eastern gate, saying, Where's that flaming sword which was given unto thee? And the angel said, I had it here, only a moment ago. I must have put it down somewhere. Forget my own head next. And the Lord did not ask him again. It appears these verses were inserted during the proof stage. In those days it was common practice for printers to hang proof sheets to the wood beams outside the shops, for the edification of the populace and some free proofreading, and since the whole print run was subsequently burned anyway, no one bothered to take up this matter with the nice Mr. A. Aziraphale, who ran the bookshop 2 doors along and was always so helpful with the translation, and whose handwriting was instantly recognizable. Bilton and Skaggs' second great publishing disaster occurred in 1653. By a stroke of rare good fortune, they obtained one of the famed Lost Quartos, the 3 Shakespeare plays never reissued in folio edition and now totally lost to scholars and playgoers. Only their names have come down to us. This one was Shakespeare's earliest play, The Comedy of Robin Hood, or The Forest of Sherwood. The other 2 are The Trapping of the Mouse, and Gold Diggers of 1589. Master Bilton had paid almost 6 guineas for the quarto, and believed he could make nearly twice that much back on the hardcover folio alone. Then he lost it. Bilton and Skaggs' third great publishing disaster was never entirely comprehensible to either of them. Everywhere you looked, books of prophecy were selling like crazy. The English edition of Nostradamus' Centuries had just gone into its 3rd printing, and the 5 Nostradamuses, all claiming to be the only genuine one, were on triumphant signing tours. And Mother Shipton's collection of prophecies was sprinting out of the shops. Each of the great London publishers, there were 8 then, had at least one book of prophecy on its list. Every single one of the books was wildly inaccurate, but their air of vague and generalized omnipotence made them immensely popular. They sold in the thousands and the tens of thousands. "It is a license to print money," said Master Bilton to Master Skaggs, who had already had a few thoughts in that direction, and spent the last years of his life in Newgate prison when he eventually put them into practice. "The public are crying out for such rubbish. We must straightway print a book of prophecy by some hag." The manuscript arrived at their door the next morning. The author's sense of timing, as always, was exact. Although neither Master Bilton nor Master Skaggs realized it, the manuscript that they had been sent was the sole prophetic work in all of human history to consist entirely of completely correct predictions concerning the following 340-odd years, being a precise and accurate description of the events that would culminate in Armageddon. It was on the money in every single detail. It was published by Bilton and Skaggs in September 1655, in good time for Christmas trade. Another masterstroke of publishing genius, because Oliver Cromwell's Puritan Parliament had made Christmas illegal in 1654. And it was the first book to be printed in England to be remaindered. It didn't sell. Not even the copy in the tiny Lancashire shop with the local author on a piece of cardboard next to it. The author of the book, one Agnes Nutter, was not surprised by this, but then it would have taken an awful lot to surprise Agnes Nutter. Anyway, she'd not written it for the sales, or the royalties, or even the fame. She had written it for the single gratis copy of the book that an author was entitled to. No one knows what happened to the legions of unsold copies of her book. Certainly, none remain in any museums or private collections. Even Aziraphale does not possess a copy. But he would go weak at the knees at the thought of actually getting his exquisitely manicured hands on one. In fact, only one copy of Agnes Nutter's prophecies remained in the entire world. It was on a bookshelf about 40 miles away from where Crowley and Aziraphale were enjoying a rather good lunch, and metaphorically, it had just begun to tick.